Hey, grace and peace, everybody. I got 45 minutes. I just want to show y'all something and see if I can get your thoughts on some of this stuff.
Conspiracy theorist by now, it's because you are not intelligent. I am not kidding. So let me tell you, if you are not a conspiracy theorist by now, it's because you are not intelligent. I am not kidding.
All right. Let me get right to it. We don't have a lot of time here. Do me a favor, just type of one as y'all are coming in. Listen to this gentleman right here. Listen to this gentleman.
The gospel of the kingdom. That was a massive concept change. So one of the speakers had a topic called the divided gospel and walked through this idea that we have really separated salvation from the message of the kingdom. In the New Testament, as Jesus begins to preach, he preaches the gospel of the kingdom. Gospel is just good news. So whatever.
Y'all heard me talking to Bishop's sister the other day. Many people are online and are saying that the church, we're preaching the death, burial, and the resurrection. And Jesus preached the gospel of the kingdom. So we're preaching half of a message. And there's been a lot of confusion. This gentleman used to be a pastor right here.
Whatever translation you're reading, it may say he went about preaching the good news about the kingdom or the gospel of the kingdom or whatever. Well, the evangelical church, Pentecostal charismatic, the schools of thought that I've been a part of growing up really focused on salvation. And with the focus on salvation, there's this idea that we want to get people saved. So people are outside the family of God. We want them to come to know Jesus. And there's almost this gap then between salvation and heaven, because the focus of Christianity, at least the focus that I grew up with, was on heaven. That there's this retirement in the sky. We're going to sit on clouds eating grapes, and the angels are going to come and feed us and take care of us. And life is really just a struggle until we get there. And we just got to be good enough and be moral enough to stay saved until the rapture happens or we die, and we finally get to go to the real point of existence, which is heaven, eternity in heaven. But it misses this huge segment of our life. Like, what is the reason that we're here? And so it's like the gospel of salvation. There's a key element of that we want to know Jesus. We want to have a relationship with Jesus, but what's the purpose of us being here? Well, the gospel of the kingdom has that it includes salvation, but the focus is that God wants us on earth, that he has us on earth for a purpose. We'll begin to unpack Genesis 1:26 to 28, that God put humans on the earth to fill it with his goodness.
Now, some people could start thinking about Michael Heiser. God wanted an extended family. Some of the people, that dominance with the 7 mountains. What are your thoughts when you start hearing this lyrically outspoken?
To come into a deep relationship with him, to expand the knowledge of him, and fill the earth with his glory, his goodness, his nature, his attributes, all of those things. That we're actually here to extend heaven to earth. These are concepts taught by people like Miles Monroe, and rediscovering a lot of these people during this season. So I realized my focus had been one of escape rather than engage, because the church that I grew up in just wanted to go to heaven.
Is there a segment of the church that just wants to go to heaven, and then a different segment of the body of believers that want to engage and believe that thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth, that we're supposed to affect government? Some will say, well, not government, but just our neighbors and other individual lives. As lives transform, that's the kingdom coming down here, as Alton, to have a praying family and transform his family and influence people on his job and those that are around him in a godly way, in a godly manner. And that's what we're to do. I don't even want to bring up, the church, because a lot of people are so confused, so much misinformation dealing with the subject of the church. Listen to this. I want to get to this spin it out in this here before everybody walk out. Most people walk out the door on the way to service. Listen to this gentleman right here. Someone asked also Journey. Let me get to that right there. Journey asked about the Olympics. I'm not really into sports and stuff like that, but the opening of the Olympics, is that a conspiracy? I don't think that's a conspiracy. One thing I could respect about occultists and Satanists and stuff, that they will keep it a buck. They're going to show you in your face, Elder Johnson, Edith. These occultists going to show you in your face. These LGBT, these people in the spiritism, they're going to show you in the face what they're into, and they're going to let you know. They're going to mock the things of God. Last Supper. They're going to mock some stuff. They don't mock Islam, if y'all notice it. Hey, boy, who doing the teaching here? Who doing the talking here? All right, let me let this video play and tie this little boy up real quick.
Because we're really going to talk just about the Genesis text. And the reason we're going to talk about the Genesis text is because everything that you read that Paul writes about the relationship between women and the church and women and
somebody called this message to him
and their husbands is based on his understanding of the Genesis text.
The women are going in. The women are
Jewish rabbi,
at 2
right?
o'clock.
So there's hardly anything that Paul would say that we wouldn't first find.
Let me stop it. The women are going in at 2 o'clock, and they're going to deal with some issues with the women in the Bible and various passages. And somebody sent me this about 1 o'clock in the morning. Guess who sent me this?
Find in the Tanakh, in the Jewish scriptures. So when you read Paul outside of the context of Jewish scriptures, you've misunderstood him right from the beginning. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to work really hard on the Genesis text, because that's the foundation of all of what Paul's talking about. And then we're going to see how Paul applies that. And I suggest to you that it will radically change the way that you understand what Paul says when he says things like that he wants women to be silent as the law says, and things like, those crazy kinds of things that he says that you wish, Paul, why did you even write that? It's such a problem. Okay, so now we're going to find out why he wrote those things and what it means from a Jewish perspective, because after all, he's the Jewish rabbi, the consulting Jewish rabbi for all of these synagogues all over in Corinth and Ephesus and Thessalonica. And when he writes to them, he's writing as a rabbi giving them instructions, right? Just as any rabbi would have given halakhic instructions. You know the difference between halakha and agadah? Do you know that? No? Okay. So there are two kinds of instructions.
Where Covey at? Somebody listening to this real good. Tell me if this is correct.
That rabbis give. One is called halakha, and a halakha is an instruction that's binding on the community that is based in some Torah principle. It has to come from the Torah, and as a result of the rabbi's explanation, it becomes a sort of like legislated regulation for the community, okay? And Paul often does that. The other is called agadah, and agadah is the rabbi's opinion, and you can take it.
Agadah. Do we have any agadah in the scripture?
Or leave it, right? Remember those passages where Paul says, I speak to you not as the Lord speaks to you? Well, every first century person would understand agadah. He's giving you his rabbinic opinion. And you're free to dismiss it if you wish. Right?
In Corinthians, did Paul give his personal opinions? This ain't from the Lord, but this is me and in my godly wisdom. Is that how we're I've understood it like that, but others have said, no. Everything Paul said comes from God. Well, what are your thoughts on that, Leo?
Right? So even though we consider it inspired, it doesn't mean that it's binding. Okay? So we'll need to make the difference, that distinction.
This could be, let me just let the video play. This could be problematic for some people in their understanding of interpretation, inspiration in the text.
When we look at what Paul says. But everything that Paul says is based in what God says through Moses in the Torah. And so what we're going to do is we're going to start there. And we're going to say, okay, wait a minute. If we understand the fundamental things, that will help us understand all the rest of this stuff. Okay? Now, to do that, we have to pretend that we are the ones who are receiving the information from God the first time. Okay? Because the issue is this. Most of us read the Bible as though it were written for us, but it wasn't. The Bible wasn't written for you. Okay? You are just the eavesdropper on a conversation that happened between Moses and the children of Israel.
This is why you would often hear people in Bible schools say the Bible was not written to us, but it was written for us. A lot of y'all can't grasp it. So everything in the Bible is speaking about you right now here in America and had no context to people 2,000 years ago on the other side of the planet.
Or between Jeremiah and Israel, or between Isaiah and Israel, or between the discussion between Ruth and Naomi. You're eavesdropping on that. It was never intended to be written to you. And so in order to understand what the text actually says, you must become the real audience, okay? So if you thought you were going to get away with just listening to information today, that isn't going to happen, because I'm going to start asking you questions to see how many. Oh, and by the way, I see a lot of you already have a copy of the book, so at the exam at the end of the day, you'll be it's open book exam, okay? Okay, so here's the idea. In order for you to understand how much of your own culture has influenced the way that you understand the scripture that you read, all you have to do is be prodded to think about what it would mean for the people who first heard it. Because one of the fundamental principles of good exegesis is, what did it mean to the audience who heard it first? Okay, so
We only
go back to the Genesis account, and we're still in the introduction here, okay? Let's go back to the Genesis account, and as we begin to look at those Genesis verses, we're going to want to ask ourselves, what did it mean to the audience who heard it first? And of course, to do that, we have to know who the first audience was, okay? So let's see what we can find out. We're going to start at the beginning, of course, right? And we have 4 critical passages that we need to look at in order to understand how God arranged the original relationship so that we can figure out how it applies to us. Now, just because the Bible wasn't written for you doesn't mean that it doesn't apply to you, okay? But the difference is, to understand what it means, we must understand what the author intended, and then we can do the application, okay? So the first thing that we need to know is, what are the critical verses in the original text that help us understand what the author intended, okay? So let me ask you this. Who is the original audience of the Genesis account? Because we're going to go to Genesis. Who are the people who heard it first? But that would be wrong. Okay? Because the story wasn't written for Adam and Eve, right? Who was the story written for? The children of Israel when? After they left Egypt. Why? That's right, to remember who they are, what they were called to do, and what their identity is, okay? So here's the problem. They've been in Egypt for a long time, over 200 years. In that 200 years, they've lived in a culture that served all kinds of pagan gods. They've lived in an
lyrically outspoken. I want you to really, really listen.
environment where they've been treated as slaves, and all of that mentality shapes who they think they are. So when they come out of Egypt, Moses has to rewrite their history so that they will understand why they are a chosen people, what God has decided to do with them, and who they belong to, okay? Because the battle between, let me ask you this.
Alton, was Moses writing with an intent? Was Moses writing history just to write a history, or was Moses writing with an intent?
The plagues that come over Egypt, were those simply natural phenomenon by which God exerts his power? No, guess what they were? They were battles between the God of Israel and the gods of Egypt. Every one of the plagues represents a god of Egypt, something that was worshipped, that God now has to combat in order to show that he is the one true sovereign God. So, for example, the river turning to blood. What's that about? Well, let's back up and let's see if we really understand the story. Okay, so you know the story, right? Let's start with the story of Moses. How does Moses become who he is anyway? How does that happen? Right? Remember, Pharaoh puts out an edict that all male children of the Jewish population will be killed, right? And so his mother hides him until it's no longer possible to hide him. He's getting too big. And then she takes him down to the river and she puts him into what? But do you know anything about what those baskets are? Okay. And do you know why he's put into the river? Because this is all part of the culture, see? We have to understand the culture in order to understand what this is all about. So when you put a body, a human being, into a basket on the river, what are you doing? You're burying him, right? Because in Egyptian culture, you put a dead body into a coffin basket. It floats on the river to the other side of the river, because the other side of the river is the realm of the dead. Okay? So when Moses' little baby is put into the coffin, it's essentially the same as going to the graveyard and watching this coffin go into the burial plot. Okay? So that's what's happening. Okay? So now the daughter of Pharaoh comes to the river. So tell me about the daughter of Pharaoh. Who's the daughter of Pharaoh? Oh, you're going to say, well, wait a minute, she's the daughter of Pharaoh. Wrong. The daughter of Pharaoh is her name. It's not her title, it's her name. And in fact, she ruled in Egypt for 60 years after Moses was taken away, right? And she dressed as a man. She dressed
y'all
as
listening to
Pharaoh
this?
because only a man could sit on the throne. And the first Pharaoh, the Pharaoh Tutmoshe, didn't have a son. He had a daughter, and her name, the daughter of Pharaoh, becomes the title by which she sits on the throne. Okay? She, however, marries, and her husband has a son through a concubine, and that son, the husband wants to get onto the throne. So now we go to the river scene, and here comes the daughter of Pharaoh. Does she go down to the river to bathe? Ask yourself if a member from the royal house would have to go to the river to take a bath. No, of course not. So why?
Is it established among scholars and historians what Pharaoh was the Pharaoh of Moses and the Exodus and all of them? What is that established? Is that established?
Why is she down there? Thank you. She goes to the river to do ritual worship to the river god. Okay? So now you're getting the background about what's going on with the river. It's the river god that she's serving in her worship. And when she goes down to the river, guess what she finds? A coffin floating in front of her on the river, sent to her by the river god. Okay? Because she doesn't have a child, the river god sends her a child in a coffin. How does she know that it's a child? Because the coffin is little. And the coffin floats toward her from the river god. And so she goes and gets the coffin. And when she opens it, what does she discover? A live baby. But of course she knows that this live baby is Jewish, right? Because he's circumcised. So it's obvious.
Bishop's sister sent me this 1 o'clock in the morning. And she's been telling me before, I want you to listen to something very profound.
That this live Jewish
They're not like us.
circumcised baby is the wrong person for the river god to send, because the Pharaoh has said you're going to kill all the live babies. Why doesn't the daughter of Pharaoh kill the live Jewish circumcised baby in the coffin? Thank you, because the river god sent him. And you don't do anything to offend the river god, because if you offend the river god, he'll punish you. So you absolutely accept his gift as a gift from the river god, which is why Moses, the obvious Jewish baby, ends up in the royal family. Okay? So all of that story has to be filled in with the culture so that you can understand.
So 2 o'clock, the sister's coming on. Yolanda Little Mother. I'm gonna put the link out there. I hit Red Letter, and we already, I think we threw it out when J Jax was on yesterday, and I hit Sister E, and we're gonna let them talk. I think we're gonna let them share, and we're gonna definitely enjoy that from 2 to 4. And I think 5 o'clock, the brothers from NHIT, those brothers from Virginia, the one I was talking about yesterday, they're going to come back on and elaborate a little more on the things that the brother was touching on. Bruce said, I want to hear, I'm not familiar with these brothers. He want to hear some more of their doctrine. Well, he's going to get to hear it today at 5 o'clock.
Why it is that Moses, a Jewish guy, is accepted as part of the royal family of Pharaoh. Okay? So now I'm the daughter of Pharaoh, and the river god has sent me a child from the dead, by the way. It's a resurrection theme, isn't it? Okay? Because he comes out of a coffin, right? And the river god sends this resurrected child for the daughter of Pharaoh who doesn't have a child. And so she names him Moshe, which is not a Hebrew word, right? Moses is not a Hebrew word. It's an Egyptian word. And the father was Tut Moshe, the god Tut, and the name Moshe.
Just say, did the Jews build the pyramids? Jay, what's good with you? Did the Jews build the pyramids?
Combined to show that the royalty were sons of God. Okay, so Tutmoshe was the father of the daughter of Pharaoh, and Tutmoshe the second is Moses, the one that we know, and Tutmoshe the third is the son of the husband of the daughter of Pharaoh by the concubine. So when Tutmoshe the second flees from Egypt and spends 40 years in the wilderness before he comes back, when he comes back, who's on the throne? Tutmoshe the third. And so now here's this, and this interesting, because all of a sudden we realize that Moses coming back to Pharaoh is the rightful Pharaoh coming back to confront the Pharaoh who usurped the throne. So there's a lot more going on here than just a prophet of God. There's political issues that affect the entire kingdom, all happening because here comes this guy who should have been the Pharaoh, and now he confronts the one who's Pharaoh.
So Moses should have been the Pharaoh. Why y'all left all this out the Bible? Just say, if you said no, they didn't build the pyramids, who started that? Who started that rumor that the Jews built the pyramids? Said, I don't believe the stuff y'all be telling me. I don't be believing a lot of it. But y'all want me to believe it in the name of God.
Pharaoh on the throne and says, my God is more powerful than your gods. Okay? And so the plagues become a battle between Yahweh and the Egyptian gods. And when all of that is done, including, by the way, why the 10th plague? Why does, many times the advisors to Pharaoh and Pharaoh himself said, okay, look, we've had enough, you can go. But God doesn't allow him to go until they get to the 10th plague. Why? What's the 10th plague about? If all the plagues are about battles between gods, why do I have to have the 10th plague? Because Pharaoh himself is a god, right? And the 10th plague shows that even Pharaoh has no power over life and death. The final Egyptian god, Pharaoh himself, his claim is Tut Moshe, I am the son of a god, okay? But Yahweh shows that he doesn't have any power. The Tut Moshe, the third, has no power over life and death. So ultimately, all of the Egyptian gods are destroyed. Now, why is that important? Because that issue comes up in the wilderness. The people who are going into the wilderness, they recognize that God has now shown himself to be sovereign over all of the Egyptian gods, but that doesn't change their thinking. When they get into the wilderness, they build a golden calf. They complain that they should have stayed in Egypt where they could have food. They're constantly thinking like slaves, okay? So Moses has to write a new history for them to show them why they are who they are, what God has in mind for them, and all of the background that they needed to know in order to be incorporated into their new identity. And that's where we pick up the story. So the story of Adam and Eve was never written to Adam and Eve. The story of Noah isn't about, God sits down with Noah one day and tells him what he's doing. Nope. The story of Abraham is not written to Abraham. Those stories were written so that there's a collective consciousness for the people of Israel to know why they are where they are. Okay? So now, in order for us to understand the Genesis account,
well, hopefully he's gonna really get somewhere that's gonna tickle my fancy, because I'm telling y'all right now. Listen to Jay. Jay said, you heard what I asked Jay. Just Save Straight answered. Jay and these squares got to take you all through all four corners. Why? I mean, you and I are the children of those builders, the true Hebrews. So you're saying the Jews didn't build the pyramids, but real Hebrews built the pyramids, Jay? I type of one if that's what you're saying. I emailed Ruddy Brew yesterday because Ruddy Brew has been here for the longest. He's been here for the longest to say he's been saying stuff for years. So I told him to get a presentation together and how we're fooled into believing that we're Ham, but we're really not Ham. The majority of us are Semites, and we are possibly Hebrews. I hope he's seen that email. Let's see what Jay say. If Jay is saying the true Hebrews built the pyramids, I don't believe none of this stuff y'all talking about. And don't tell me I don't believe the Bible. The word he said, there is no hieroglyph that spells Egypt, nor Pharaoh. Egypt was the son of Zeus. Egyptus was the son of I'm talking about, all right, maybe that's a side conversation.
You have to become the people in the wilderness who've just come out of Egypt, who need to know, why is God doing this? And who am I and where did I come from? Okay? The kind of basic stuff that you need for any tribal identity, because that's what it is, right? Moses now tells you, here is our tribal history, so that you will know who you are, where you come from, and what you're supposed to do. Okay? So let's start with Genesis 1, 26 and 27. Right, because you guys already knew that, right? It was so obvious, okay? Okay? I mean, here's the problem. We read the scripture as though it belongs to us, right? And so when we read, so for example, when we read this verse, what does Genesis 1, 26 and 27 say? Don't look it up on your phone, okay? And God said, let us make man in our own image according to our likeness, and let him rule over, okay? Remember that verse? Okay? So here's the problem. We read that, and God said, let us make man in our own image, and the first thing we think of is our definition of image. So what's our definition of image?
All right,
I said
let's
to you,
listen to
what's
this.
an
Now that
image?
we
What
got
would you
past
tell me?
that, let's listen to some of this.
A picture, a representation, a copy, a Xerox, okay? So if I took this piece of paper and I said, make me an image of this, you'd run over to the copy machine, you'd put it on the machine, and you'd have an image, okay? And I would say, okay, well, that's the original. You'd say, no, this is a copy. The original is this, okay? So when we think of image, we think of representative icon. We think of something that occupies space and time. So if I made a copy of this page, I would have another page. Would have the same words on it, right? I'd have one space and time occupying thing here and another space and time occupying thing here. But guess what? In Hebrew, the idea that I exist because I occupy space and time isn't part of the Hebraic worldview. The Hebraic worldview is based on verbs, not nouns. This is a noun, a piece of paper, a copy. This is a representation of a noun, a copy of it, okay? But in Hebrew, what matters is the action, not the substance. So when you read, let us make man in our own image, you think substance. You don't think verb, okay? How do I know that? Because I just came back from Lisbon. I've been to Europe many times. You go to big cathedrals, you go to the Sistine Chapel, and you look up at the ceiling, and guess what you see? An image of God. Only the problem is you don't see a verb painted up there, right? Tell me how you paint a verb, right? No, you paint a noun. In other words, when you look up, you see a person, a representation of a copy of what you look like. Remember the Michelangelo, the famous Michelangelo painting, right? Here's Adam. He's got his finger out like this. Here's God, and there's a little spark of life going between two. Guess what we have up there? Icon representations of pictures of what we look like portrayed as God, okay? So God is just older than me. He's got a long white.
Wait a minute. Listen to this one right here, y'all. The angels are the builders of the pyramid. I was just able to knew that before the flood. So that's the altar of the Lord that Isaiah speaks about. So the pyramids in Egypt are why did the angels build them? The Most High Yah, they're connected with Yah. And he as a testament, why the angels built the pyramids before the flood?
Beard, he's got bigger muscles, whatever. But it's just a picture. It's a substitution of our image replacing God's image, okay? But of course, what does God say? Don't make any images of me. Why?
I'm wondering if y'all doing too much with the Bible. Because you can take the Bible and do more than what the Bible was intended to do. What was the Bible put here for? What was the Bible put here for?
Because he's a verb. He's not a noun, right? When Moses asks, what is your name, God? What does God tell him? I am that I am. Okay? Guess what? That's a difficult translation in English, because it tries to capture what is only exists in Hebrew in an English form. Because it doesn't say I am that I am. It actually could say I am that I am, I will be who I will be. All those. Why? Because it's a verb, right? It isn't translatable into a statement about some characteristic of a person. It's a verb. God talks in verbs, right? So when I read, let us make man in our own image, the first thing I have to realize is God's thinking verb, not noun. Okay? Now, how does that change what I understand about image? Well, if you go to systematic theologies that view the text as Greek, they will tell you that being in the image of God is what? Tell me the normal things that people have told you. What does it mean to be in the image of God? 3 parts, yes, body, mind, and soul, or body, mind, and spirit, whatever. That comes right out of Plato. It's not part of Scripture. Because in Hebrew, there's only one word, nephesh, and it doesn't mean body, mind, and soul. It means the homogenized embodiment of a person. Everything about you in one thing. Okay? So, first thing we have to do is get rid of the idea of compartmentalizing a human being. But that's still icon representation. What if I said, look, I'll go back to Greek philosophy, right? What if I said, okay, look, here's the idea. In order to be a human being, I have to have reason, so rationality, okay? I have to have volition, so I have a will, okay? I have to have what? Emotions, right? I have to have cognitive abilities, okay? I have to have, and now I start going through the list. And ultimately, I'll end up where Thomas Aquinas ends up. What Thomas Aquinas does is gives us a definition of what it means to be a man by opposing the definition of what it means to be God. So, God is infinite, man is finite. God is omnipresent, man is limited in one place at one time. God is eternal, man is temporal, right? God is immortal, man is mortal. That's called the via negativa. And there's a whole long list of those. Perfection, immutability, impassibility, all those kinds of things that Aquinas said, look, if God is like this, then we are, by analogy, kind of like God, but we're not God. So we just represent him in a diminished capacity. Okay? Yeah, we're a little lower than the angels, right? Which means that God knows everything and I only know some things. Okay? God can be everywhere and I can only be one place at one time. God lives forever and I don't. All that kind of stuff. Okay? So when we talk about image of God, we think in those kinds of terms. We don't think in the kinds of terms that the Egyptian ex-slaves who came out to the wilderness would think, because in their language, it's verbs that matter, not nouns. Okay? So let me ask you, if you thought of God as a verb, what would it mean to be in his image? Now see, look how difficult that is. Because you're thinking, wait a minute, what does it mean? And here's the interesting thing. You've been reading that verse since you were little, and you never realized that it's not about any of the things you think about, right? It's about verbs, not about nouns. So if you think of God as a verb, what do you think of? What characteristics belong to God as a verb? Thank you. Creating, okay? Ordering, okay? How about legislating? How about nourishing? How about supporting? How about chastising? How about all of the things? Now, all of a sudden, these images are starting to change, right? So if you really wanted to think about God as a verb, and you really needed to know what God thinks about himself, where would you go in the Old Testament to realize what God thinks of when he thinks of himself as a verb? You could go to his names. That would be really interesting. But there is a place in the Old Testament where God actually tells you what he is as a verb. Yes, remember when Moses says, remember, this is all part of the background. So what does Moses say? He says, oh God, we have such a good relationship. I really love talking to you. It would be really great if I could just see your glory. And God says, great idea. Problem is, it will toast you. Okay? I mean, no man can see my glory and live. So I appreciate the request, Moses, but you didn't think that one through clearly. Okay? So he says, I will put you in the cleft of the rock and I will pass by you. And now here's an interesting and terrible English translation. What does it say in English when he says, and I will pass by you and you will see what? Yeah, my back parts. Okay? Now that's really interesting because if God is a verb, does he have back parts? No, because back parts indicates that there's an image there, a representation, a substance. And you can't see the back parts of an invisible God, can you? So obviously the translation can't be correct, right? So that means we're forced to go look at the Hebrew. And the Hebrew word there is a derivative of the Hebrew word for the future, aharit. Okay? Isn't this interesting? Because in Hebrew, the future is behind me. Why? Because I can't see it. That's why. In Greek, the future is in front of me. So I look into the future to see where I'm going. But the Hebrew people are much, much smarter than that. And they realize that no one understands where they're going. So the future must be behind me where I can't see it. Okay? So they use a word that means the future, but it is the picture of a man in a rowboat looking into his past and unable to see where he's going. Okay? Think about a rowboat. Okay? When you row a boat, which direction do you look? Where you've come from. You look where you've been, not where you're going. You ever try to row a boat by looking where you're going? You get off course all the time because you're doing this all the time, right? Okay? So the way to row a boat is to line yourself up with the past, where you've been, and keep those buoy markers in line so that as you row, you will stay in a straight line. And that's exactly the Hebrew idea of the future. The Hebrew idea of the future is, if I know where I've been, and I know where God's been, then I can get a line and I will row in the right direction. Which is why Moses has to provide these stories, doesn't he? Because if he went into the wilderness and said, here we are, God. It's great to be here. We're so glad we're out of Egypt. So, where are we going? He needs to know, his people need to know what God did with Adam and Eve, what he did with Noah, what he did with Abraham, what he did with Joseph, what he did with all those people so that they have buoy markers, so they can get lined up and row correctly according to God's prior involvement with human beings. And the best part about that is, I don't have any guesswork about where I'm going if I'm lined up with the past, because I can see the past. You can see what God did with your parents, what he did with your grandparents, what he's done with all the background that you come from, all your legacy, all your heritage. You can see all of that. You can see it all the way back to Adam. And God says, if you get lined up with that, then row. Don't worry about where you're going, because I'll make sure that that alignment takes you where you need to be. Okay? Think about how backwards we are in a Greek culture, because we think that we have to plan our future. Okay? So let me ask you this. How many of you 10 years ago planned to be here today? No. How many of you 10 years ago planned anything that happened the way that you planned it? Right. That's the beauty is, the longer you live, the more you realize none of your plans came true. Okay? Right? And if you get old enough, you'll figure out that life isn't about planning. Life is about purpose. And the purpose is what God has in mind, not the plan. Okay? So the best part about this is, think about how strange it is that we train our children to act according to the question, what do you want to be when you grow up? Because that's a plan, right? Or I want to be a doctor, therefore I got to do this, I got to do this. I plan out my future, not realizing that it's God's purpose that matters, not my plan, right? So the real question is, what does God want you to do? Not what do you want to be? You see the difference? One of them says, I'm in charge of the plan. I can, look, we have the songs all the time, seize your destiny, listen to your heart, follow the direct, it's like crazy. The culture just teaches you exactly the wrong question, because the right for your purpose, okay? And if you can't answer that question, just row anywhere you want, because you'll get there, okay? So the whole point is Moses has to give his people all of this background because for 200 years they've been living according to Pharaoh's purpose. And Pharaoh's taught them to be slaves, and he's taught them to do whatever the master asks, right? Without thinking about their history and their background. So now Moses has to undo all of that by providing a new story that will give them the directions that they need so that they can go into the future, right? By paying attention to what God's done in the past. Okay, so here's the best part. God puts Moses into the cleft of the rock. He passes by. As he passes by, the scripture, now that you know it doesn't say that he says the back parts, the scripture says, and Moses saw what? The future. Thank you very much. Moses saw behind God's head. In other words, in idiomatic expression, Moses saw what God is going to do. God gave Moses a glimpse of what God is going to do with Israel. In other words, Moses had a vision when God went by of what Israel was going to become. Right? So did Moses see God's glory? Yes, he did. He didn't see God's glory as God himself is glorified, but he saw God's glory in terms of what God is going to do with the very people that Moses is in charge of. And it's beautiful, it's awesome, it's powerful, but it doesn't get translated, does it? No, we miss the whole point because we don't understand the culture. Okay? So when God passes by and Moses sees a vision of what God is going to do, God tells Moses who he is. Remember the verse? Exodus 34, 6 and 7, the most important verses that you'll ever read in the Tanakh, because God describes himself. So if you want to know who you're supposed to be, and you're supposed to be like God, right? Let us make man in our own image, which means I'm supposed to be like him. Then if he tells me what he's like, I can ask myself if I'm like that, can't I? Okay, so let's see what he says. The Lord, what's the first thing that he says? Compassionate. Thank you very much. The very first thing God says about himself is that he is compassionate. Okay? Now, remember, it's not a noun. It's a verb, which means that you have to do something. It isn't simply that you think about it. Okay? So it doesn't do you any good to be compassionate in your heart. You have to actually do something about it. Okay? So God goes by Moses, and the first thing he says is compassionate. Now, you know that Hebrew is made up of, it's a language of consonants, right? There are no vowels in Hebrew, right? You realize that. Everybody knew that? Okay, so consonants are like the architectural, where's my architecture student? Thank you. Okay, so if you're going to build this building, and you put up the steel frame, are you required to make the walls and the ceilings and everything just look like this? No, you can, as long as you got the frame, you can put any kind of wall construction that you want on it, right? So think of the wall constructions as the vowels and the steel frame as the consonants. So in Hebrew, once I have the steel frame in place, I can put any kind of walls I want on it because I just have to change the vowels, right? Same word, same steel structure, just different walls, okay? And that's exactly what happens with vowels in Hebrew. If I change the vowel, I change the exterior of the word, but I don't change the interior of the word. The word stays the same in its interior. Its structure is the same, okay? So the word for compassion is rahum, okay? It has the consonants RHM in English, okay? And the vowels can get changed to raham. I just changed the U to an A, and I get a different word. But in rabbinic thinking, because the consonants are same, the two words must have connection. So rahum and raham are connected. How? Because the word for compassion must be connected to the word for raham, whatever that means. And guess what it means? Raham is the word for the womb. So if you want to know what compassion means, you must go ask a pregnant woman what her relationship is to her unborn child. That's what compassion means. And if you don't have that kind of intensity, that kind of bond, when God says to be compassionate, if you don't have the same kind of unbreakable connection that a woman has with a child that she's carrying who isn't born, then you don't understand God's compassion. Right? Because it's the same word, just different vowels. And God says the very first thing about him, the very first thing you need to know about God is that he's a pregnant woman. Okay? That will definitely change your idea that men have a hierarchy in life. Okay? Because God describes himself as a pregnant woman, the very first thing that he says about himself. Right? Who is God carrying? Israel. So when God passes by Moses, he passes by Moses as a pregnant woman carrying the child Israel, and Moses is allowed to see what God is going to do as he births Israel. Okay? And we could go on. There's a whole thing on this. But you got the idea now? So it's compassionate, merciful, long-suffering, slow to anger. All of those things, which is a whole study on. Maybe this afternoon we can do that. Okay? That whole idea is what it means to be in God's image. And it's all about what I do. Do I act with compassion like that? Do I? Another one is arik apayim, which means a long nose. God is a pregnant woman with a really long nose. Okay? I mean, they're all imageries. It's all idioms. Okay? What does arik apayim mean? Slow to anger. Why? Because anger is deferred by taking a long time to breathe. Don't we do the same thing? We say when somebody gets really mad, we say, look, take a deep breath. Count to 10, right? And what we're saying is slow your anger down so that it doesn't take over on you. And exactly the same imagery is in Hebrew. Arik apayim. God has a really long nose, which means it takes him a long time to breathe, and therefore his anger is deferred. Okay? So now you get to ask yourself, do I have a long nose? Because if I don't have a long nose, I'm not in God's image, am I? Because this is what God says his image is like. He's compassionate. He has a long nose. Okay? There's a lot of other things that we could look at. But the idea is we have to first adjust our idea of image. Okay? So, now that we've adjusted that idea of image, guess what? We can now understand why Moses starts his story with, let us make man in our own image. Why? Okay, so now you're in the 16th century BC. You're the audience that's listening to Moses talk, and you have already come to that place with an idea of image of your own. And Moses has to rewrite it. He has to rewrite your definition of image. So you just came out of Israel. You just came out of Egypt, okay? And in Egypt, you were a slave. What was your view of what it means to be in the image of anything as a slave? Why were you there? You were there to serve Pharaoh, okay? And your entire identity is wrapped up in Pharaoh as a god, okay? Now, guess what? Every ancient mythology, every ancient cosmology has a place where gods create men, okay? In Babylonian mythology, in Assyrian, in Egyptian, the gods always create men. They create men to do particular things. Now, if you're a god, or a goddess in this case, and there's some things you don't want to do, and you can create men to do those things, what would those things be? You create men to do what? Yeah, how about clean the toilets? Gods don't normally clean toilets, but it'd be nice to have somebody clean them. So you create men to clean the toilets. You create men to work the fields. You create men to do the dishes. You create men to take out the garbage. That sounds pretty much what we do, doesn't it? Right? Okay? In other words, you create men to do all the tasks that gods don't do, because gods enjoy life. They play. They do whatever they want. Their world is occupied with pleasure and desire. Therefore, you create men to do all that other stuff. Okay? So that imagery is already in place when the children of Israel come out of Egypt, because they've been taught for 200 years that that's what their purpose is. Their purpose in life is to serve the god Pharaoh, okay? To make his life enjoyable, desirable, and pleasant while they do everything else, okay? So they already have that. Now here comes Moses, and he says, don't you realize that in our history, God created man in his own image? Wow is right, because all of a sudden I realize that God created me to be a partner with him, not to be a servant of his, not to be his slave, but to enter into a relationship with him to do what? Let us make man in our image and according to our likeness, in order to do what? To rule, to take dominion. But in Egypt, no slave ever took dominion or ruled. Slaves served, period. So Moses has to rewrite the story so that I will realize that I'm no longer a slave. I've come out of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. And now my purpose in life is to share in the project that God has.
I wonder if he have a low view of scripture. Boy, I'm going to give God some praise. I'm done with this, dude. We'll talk about this in the back chat. This here. And I just wonder why some people in ministry and pastors and bishops will hear stuff on YouTube and grab hold of it. Some of the nonsense folk done heard in jail, on the streets, on the block, and in the barbershop a long time ago. You got some preachers just handing there and thinking it's deep thought. I'm shutting this live down right now in Jesus' holy name.